I was born in 1936, a very long time ago, in England, in the southeast corner of England, in the county of Kent, which is known as the Garden of England. But unfortunately, shortly after I was born, 3 years after I was born, the Second World War started from 1939 until 1945. And because we are close, Kent is close to London, the German planes would come over Kent, and they were aiming for the docks, the London docks, to drop bombs on the docks. And of course, a lot of those bombs didn't hit the right targets. So we were in the direct line of fire. So we spent, we had to build, my father and friends had to build an air raid shelter in the garden, deep in the ground, under the ground. And we would have to sleep in the air raid shelter at night. And it was pretty scary because you could hear the explosions all around. And then my parents decided to send me make me into an evacuee, and I was sent to Scotland by myself. I had to travel on the train to Scotland to my uncle and aunt and cousin. And I stayed there for, I would think, 8 or 9 months. And I had to go to school in Glasgow. In Glasgow, they have a very, very difficult accent for outsiders to understand. And I often couldn't understand the teacher. And he got very angry with me. And in those days, they still used the leather strap. And so I had to hold out my hand, and he would bring down a leather strap on my hand. And it was because I couldn't understand what he was saying. So I was pretty unhappy at that school. Finally, my parents brought me back home because my father thought the war was over, or more or less over. And then we were sort of settling down, and just a week or so after he brought me back, the very last German bombers came over, and they were dropping the final kinds of bombs, the V1 and the V2 as they were called. And a V2 was dropped in our garden very shortly before the end of the war. It was the second to last bomb of the whole war. And it exploded, and it actually destroyed the air raid shelter, but we were not in it. We were in the kitchen eating breakfast. But we were all hurt. My parents fairly seriously, my father quite badly, and my mother was cut all over, huge cuts. And I was more or less okay because the floor of the kitchen collapsed and I sort of fell through, and so I was protected. But of course, there's shock waves and things, and then people would rush in and pull you out and sit you to wait for the ambulances to come. And it was clear that that there had been some deaths among the neighbours around us. And we were put into an ambulance, and they asked me if I wanted to go with my mother, and I said yes. And they put me in the ambulance with the person they thought was my mother. And it wasn't. It was the next door neighbor, and she was dying. So it was a very, very traumatic time indeed. And I think I think those. I often think these days with things like the wars that are going on in Syria and the Middle East, there's now millions and millions and millions of children who are going to have lifelong traumatic effects from these kind of events, much worse than anything I went through. But I can still feel the effects in me at times. I can't stand really loud noises. I just can't deal with it at all. And so there's a lesson in these wars. Obviously, they're appalling. And people think about the triumph of war and celebrate the triumph of war. And I find that I'm very uncomfortable about that kind of thing. It's not totally inappropriate as far as I'm concerned. So, Oh, we kids used to collect shrapnel in the war. Shrapnel are the bits and pieces off the bombs, right? And we would run out after the air raid, and we would collect little bits of shrapnel, and we would trade the shrapnel in our shrapnel collection to get the best presentation of shrapnel, for heaven's sake, you know. But I grew up to love London, and always have, and think of London as my second or third or fourth home. I'm very, very attached to London, and always will be, despite Brexit. And London didn't vote for Brexit. So I went to a girls' school. I went to primary school, and then from primary school I went on to a girls' high school. At the age of, we all did an exam at the age of 11, and were divided up into different levels of schools. That's all changed in England now, but in those days, and I went on to what was called a girls' grammar school. But these are public schools; they're not private schools. They're state schools, but if you have to pass an exam to get into them, and we had to wear uniforms, and I didn't like the uniform, and I especially didn't like the beret hat thing that we had to wear, and we're supposed to wear it outside all the time, and I never did, and I used to get told off and had to go to see the principal and things like that because I wouldn't wear my uniform properly and so on. But on the whole, I think we got a really, really good, sound, basic education across the board, except, of course, being England, for training in a second language. We had some French, but it was taught very badly indeed. And the mademoiselle that didn't come very often, and it wasn't very good at all. But otherwise, I think the education was really good. And we had a lot of sport, and I really became a jock. I loved sport. I could run very fast, and we played a game called Rounders, which is like a baseball for young girls. Very similar, actually, but a much smaller ball and a much smaller bat and so on. And we did field hockey, and we did tennis, of course, and not much swimming in those days because there wasn't a decent swimming pool. So it came time to do the final exams at school, and you already in England, still today to some extent, you have to start specialising in high school. And you have to start muttering about what you think you might want to become, and then you're separated out into different classes. And I thought at that point, still being very immature, that I wanted to spend my life teaching physical education to people. So I would be a PE teacher. And so that meant that in my last 2 years at school, I should take biology and in addition chemistry and physics, because rather than doing history or English or languages or religion or anything like that, I would be going more on the science side in order to be able to help with, I suppose, with injuries and understanding how the body works and all the rest of it. So that's what I did. In my last 2 years at school, all I did was chemistry, botany, zoology, and physics. And so that meant that when it came to applying for universities, it was very limited, already limited about what my choice could be. In other words, it was, without me really thinking it through much at all, it was settled that I would have to go into a science discipline at university. So in those days, it was very, very unusual for women to go to university at all. And even from my school, which was a very, very good state school, virtually nobody, it was all girls' school with no boys, virtually nobody went to university. And I decided that I really wanted to do this. Nobody in my family had ever been to university, and so it was a bit complicated as to how this might come about. But I managed to get some interviews, and the woman who came down from Leeds University, which is in the north of England, to interview prospective students in the south of England, when I went to London to meet her and talk with her, she looked at what I'd done and she said, "Well, I think you're a bit old," she said. I was 20 years old, right? She said, "I think you're a bit old," because I'd had these extra years in school, and I'd worked as a lab tech for a couple of years and then decided I wanted to go to university. So she said, "I think you're really a bit old, but I think I'm going to take a chance on you." So that settled things. So I had to go all the way to Leeds in the Yorkshire, in the very north of England. And that's where I first experienced discrimination. There is serious discrimination in Britain, and there certainly was in those days between the north and the south. The south being understood as being all hoity-toity and upper class, which we certainly were not. My father was an accountant who went on the train to London every day, and my mother was a housewife. We were sort of lower middle class-ish. But they thought the people in the north tended to think everyone in the south was, rolling in money and very snotty. So whenever they heard my accent, when I would be sitting on a bus in Leeds, there would be comments and rude comments about being a southerner and so on. So I began to get sort of a little bit of a feeling for what discrimination is like. I mean, it's not the same as, obviously, as racial, nothing like as severe as that. But still, the feeling that people don't get on well with each other on many occasions, and it can lead to a lot of problems. So I went to Leeds, and I did biochemistry there and bacteriology, and that was what I was what I graduated in the end. And I became part of there were only 10% of women in the university population. Only 10% were women, and the rest were all men. So we women had a pretty good time at university. But I then became part of the brain drain, what was known as people from Britain leaving to come to Canada and Australia particularly, and some to South Africa, but I think the majority actually came to Canada, and it was called the brain drain by the Brits. And I was taken on at Toronto University, as a lab tech in a lab there, because I had all this science training and biochemistry and so on. So I worked in a lab in Toronto for a year, and then decided that I really had to go on and get an advanced degree rather than just being at the very bottom of the heap, or I had to change what I wanted to do, or I should take off and travel for a bit. And so in the end, I teamed up with an Australian friend of mine, and she and I bought an old car and drove all across Canada, starting in Toronto, not all across Canada, but starting in Toronto, and we drove out west. And there were no made-up roads. The roads were not tarmac, they were gravel. And we got about 7 or 8 burst tires, and we got very good at changing tires. I remember very clearly, of course, the prairies were pretty boring, pretty flat, and they went on. And then we finally get to Banff, and we stopped there to make some money, and we were working in a restaurant, and we were working in a Chinese restaurant serving chop suey to cowboys. And then we finally had enough money to move on, and we drove out to Vancouver, where I went back in to do a little more lab work in Vancouver, and then we decided to drive north to the Yukon. Whitehorse and the Yukon, and we did. This old car sort of managed somehow or other, And we got to Dawson City in the Yukon Territory. And my friend, Palmer, my Australian friend, took one look at the owner of the Dawson City, of the bar in Dawson City, and decided she rather liked him. And he turned out to be an Austrian who had got himself to the Yukon Territory very, very early and was making a good living as owning a bar. And he and Palmer are still together. He died recently, many, many, many years later, but she became the school teacher in Dawson City, and they had a child, and she's still up there, and I have to go and find her. I came down by myself to Vancouver, worked in the lab there, and then came on down to San Francisco and the Bay Area, because that's where I thought the action was at that time. So that's really the sort of where I started. First of all, I started to think, again, I was in a lab, and I met my husband Richard there. He's still my husband, amazingly enough. And I met him we were working in the same big building on the hill, one of the hills in San Francisco. He was in one lab and I was in another lab. And I lived in San Francisco for a little while, and then decided that Richard announced that he was going off to Japan to do, he had been captain of Cambridge's judo team, and he decided that he wanted to go for the Olympics in Tokyo. And particularly he was interested in the judo. So he announced that he was going off to Japan, and he went to Japan. And then our stories differ after that. His version is that I wrote to him and begged and said, I really want to join you in Japan. And my version is that he wrote to me and begged me to join him in Japan, right? So anyway, that's what happened. And I started to learn Japanese at that point and get very, very interested, obviously, in Japan, which you wouldn't recognize the Japan that we got to know. It was a country that was where people still urinated in the street, and all sorts of customs and habits that you could never associate with Japan of today. It has transformed beyond belief, as everybody knows. But that's where my interest in Japan started to develop, and I realized that, and I was teaching English language at that time in Japan, but I realized that if I was going to do this, I would need to do anthropology and make Japan my country of interest, my site, my research site. And so one way and another, we got ourselves back to Berkeley. And Richard was taken into comparative literature, and I was eventually taken into anthropology. At first, Jack Potter at Berkeley told me that he thought I probably wasn't good enough for Berkeley and I should go and look somewhere else. So I got myself into East Asian studies and then worked my way back into anthropology. So, and I've never felt very comfortable with Jack Potter ever since then. So the people who influenced me in those earlier days were particularly Robert Bellow, who was on my thesis committee. He's a sociologist, a very famous sociologist, who worked in Japan and did a lot of historical stuff and modernization of Japan, a really amazing person. Elizabeth Coulson was also on my PhD committee, and she works in Africa and actually has gone back to Africa and retired in Africa I think she's in Zaire. And she was a wonderful thesis advisor. She was somebody who you knew read your stuff properly and thought about it and had good questions. And often Laura Nader would come in and join in the conversation, so they were pretty fierce questions. William Cordill also influenced me a lot. He's a psychological anthropologist who worked in Japan and had done research in Japan, and I conferred with him a great deal before going and setting up my field work over there for the first time. And then in other influences over the years, I have always been very attached. I never met him. Victor Turner. I've read everything I think he's written, and always thought that the way he went about doing his research was just marvelous, and the kind of thing that we should all try and emulate. Charles Leslie has always been very, very special to me. He's the man that got me. He worked in India himself, but he was deeply involved in the beginnings of medical anthropology. And I'll mention this in a while. I did an edited book, which I co-authored, which was a festschrift for Charles Leslie. Takeo Doi has always been very important to me. He's a Japanese psychoanalyst. And René Dubois has always been super important to me. And Marcel Mauss has always been one of my very favorites. And I think his break from Durkheim was absolutely crucial, and something which I follow. I mean, years later, obviously, I was following that move, and his effort to reunite the social and the biological in a way that Durkheim was not willing to do or didn't engage with, I think was extraordinarily important, especially for the kind of anthropology that I became particularly interested in. And later in life, the people who've influenced me a lot are people like Donna Haraway, Bruno Latour, Ian Hacking, and my very, very close colleague here at McGill, Alan Young, who has taught me so much. I can never thank him enough. So we were occupied while I was at Berkeley doing my PhD with the Vietnam War, because that was taking place at that time. There wasn't much time to sit around and have intellectual exchanges. We were out on the streets a lot. And we marched to the Oakland Induction Center and did other things like that. But Richard and I had to be very careful because we were not Americans. And if the police had picked us up, we would have been kicked out of the country. So it was a very, very busy time. And as senior graduate students, we often were asked to go and give talks in the areas around San Francisco to in community centers and so on about Southeast Asia, because we didn't really know Southeast Asia, but Richard was following broadcasts that were going out of Vietnam into Japan, and so we sort of kept up with a view of what was going on from the East about what that war was all about. And we were very occupied with trying to educate Americans about that side of it. It was a very busy time, an important time, and there really wasn't time to sit about thinking about big theories in anthropology in those days. But it was, when I wrote that thesis, it was just at the time when the discipline of medical anthropology was really being discovered, was coming to life. And the man at Berkeley who was most who had the most influence on this was George Foster, and a colleague of his called Barbara Anderson. And they wrote one of the early books on medical anthropology. And I immediately decided, having already been to Japan and done quite a bit of research in Japan, I immediately decided that I was not comfortable with their approach to this thing that they were calling medical anthropology, because George Foster's position right from the outset was that it did not include an analysis of biomedicine or Western medicine, that this was scientific and separate and special, and all we could do would be to study all the ethnomedicines around the world. And so I didn't ever work with him. I really took exception to that position. And I think especially so from having already been working in Japan for quite some time and having engaged with the beginnings of with the revival of the traditional Japanese medical system in Japan, in a country which already had a very advanced socialized healthcare system. They got that as early as the 1950s. So the big question is, why would they turn back to acupuncture and herbal medicine when everybody had access to healthcare, but it wasn't working, it wasn't healing them properly? And so that was the beginning of a very big shift, both in the development of medical anthropology and in an understanding of how important an analysis is of contemporary science of all kinds, including medicine and biomedicine.